I've decided to start a new life without you." Richard's words sliced through the champagne-soaked celebration like a blade through silk. We were at the Meridian, Savannah's most exclusive restaurant, surrounded by 50 of our closest friends and family, gathered to toast our daughter Isabella's graduation from Emory University with highest honors. Richard stood there, champagne flute still raised, his announcement replacing what should have been a proud father's speech about his daughter's achievements. The restaurant fell silent. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Every eye in that opulent dining room turned toward our table, waiting for the explosion they expected. The tears. The screaming. The dramatic exit that any normal woman would make after being publicly humiliated by her husband of 28 years. Instead, I smiled. A calm, serene smile that I'd been practicing in the mirror for 3 months. "Congratulations on your honesty, Richard." My voice carried perfectly across the silent room, steady as granite, sweet as honey. What Richard didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had been planning this moment down to the last detail. By the time this night was over, the man who thought he was publicly destroying me would discover that he had just handed me the keys to everything he held dear. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled my cheating husband's entire world in the most spectacular way possible, let me know in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought they knew you? Because what happened next will show you exactly why you should never, ever underestimate a woman who's been quietly planning her revenge. And if you want to hear more stories about people who got exactly what they deserved, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because trust me, this is just the beginning. My name is Victoria Sterling. I'm 54 years old, and until this moment, I had been playing the role of the devoted wife and mother to absolute perfection. I had put my own career aspirations on hold to support Richard through 3 business ventures, 2 career changes, and countless finding himself phases that seemed to coincide with expensive hobbies and younger women. I raised our brilliant daughter Isabella, who sat beside me now, her graduation cap still perfectly positioned on her dark hair, her face frozen in absolute horror as she watched her father systematically destroy our family in front of everyone who mattered to us. From the corner of my eye, I could see Natasha Palmer shifting uncomfortably at a back table. 28 years old, blonde, ambitious, and currently having an affair with my husband. She sat with people I had considered friends for decades, the same friends who apparently knew about Richard's infidelity but had never thought to warn me. The same Natasha who had attended our Christmas parties, who had once called me asking for career advice, who had smiled to my face while sleeping with my husband behind my back. With practiced calm, I reached into my Hermes handbag, a 25th anniversary gift from Richard, ironically, and pulled out a sealed cream-colored envelope. I placed it gently beside Richard's plate, right next to the expensive steak he'd ordered to celebrate what he thought would be his moment of triumph. "What's this?" he asked, his confident expression faltering for the first time since he'd started his little speech. "Something for you to read later," I replied, keeping my voice steady and calm. Then I turned to Isabella, whose face had gone completely pale. I kissed her cheek gently. "I am so proud of you, sweetheart. This day is still about your accomplishment, and nothing can take that away from you." I stood up, smoothed down my black Chanel dress, another anniversary gift that was about to become very ironic, and addressed our stunned guests with the grace of a woman who had been hosting dinner parties for 3 decades. "Please, everyone, enjoy your meal. I wish you all a lovely evening." With that, I walked out of the Meridian with my head held high, feeling 50 pairs of eyes following my every step. The heavy mahogany door swung shut behind me, cutting off the beginning of what I knew would be frantic whispers and shocked conversations. Outside, the humid Savannah evening hit me like a wall, but for the first time in years, I could breathe freely. Behind me, I heard the restaurant door bang open, followed by Richard's voice, no longer confident and commanding, but high-pitched and desperate. "Victoria! What the hell is this? What have you done?" I kept walking toward my car, allowing myself a small, satisfied smile. The envelope I'd handed him contained the beginning of my revenge, a revenge I'd been meticulously planning for 6 months. But let me tell you exactly how I got to this point. Because what Richard had forgotten was that I wasn't just some housewife he could discard. I was Victoria Sterling, and I had been playing chess while he was playing checkers. I had always been the practical one in our marriage. While Richard dreamed big and took risks, I maintained the stability our family needed. I was the one who saved for Isabella's education when Richard invested unwisely in his friend's restaurant venture that collapsed within 2 years. I was the one who worked 60-hour weeks as a senior financial analyst at Meridian Trust when Richard's midlife crisis led him to quit his stable position to follow his passion, selling handcrafted furniture. A passion that lasted exactly 4 months before he grew bored and decided he was meant for bigger things. My own dreams, opening a financial consultancy for women going through major life transitions, were perpetually on hold. After Isabella graduates, I told myself. After Richard finds his footing. Always after, never now. But 6 months ago, everything changed when I noticed discrepancies in our joint accounts. Small transfers, always on Fridays, always to an account I didn't recognize. Having spent 25 years managing our family's finances, these irregularities stood out like neon signs in the dark. I could have confronted Richard immediately. A younger, more trusting version of myself would have done exactly that. But something held me back. Perhaps intuition, perhaps the growing distance between us over the past 2 years, or perhaps the way he had started guarding his phone like a state secret. Instead, I began quietly investigating. What I discovered was so much worse than a simple affair. Richard had been systematically moving funds to a separate account for over 18 months. He had been taking Natasha to expensive restaurants, purchasing jewelry that never found its way to me, and, this was the part that made my blood run cold, looking at beachfront property in Charleston, all while telling me we needed to tighten our belts for retirement. But the real revelation came when I discovered text messages on Richard's phone. Messages he thought he had deleted, but which I recovered using software I'd learned about in a corporate fraud investigation at work. The messages weren't just about their affair. They were detailed plans for their future together. Plans that involved Richard divorcing me after Isabella's graduation, plans that assumed I was too financially dependent and emotionally devastated to fight back effectively. After the graduation, I'll tell her it's over, Richard had written. A public setting is better. She won't make a scene in front of everyone. Natasha's response, and she has no idea about the money we've been saving. Richard's reply, none. Victoria trusts me completely. That's always been her weakness. Reading those words, something fundamental shifted inside me. The woman who had spent 28 years seeking Richard's approval, making his dreams possible, sacrificing her own ambitions for his comfort, that woman died in that moment. What Richard had forgotten, or perhaps never fully understood, was that I hadn't just been a housewife for the past 3 decades. I had been a financial professional for 25 years. I understood money trails. I knew how to trace assets. I had connections throughout Savannah's legal and financial community. And most importantly, I remembered every single detail of the prenuptial agreement we had signed 28 years ago. When we got married, I had actually been the one with more family money. My father had been a successful real estate developer, and I had inherited a substantial trust fund. Richard, fresh out of business school and drowning in student loans, had been the one who insisted on the prenup. He claimed it was to protect both of our futures, but really he was worried about protecting his potential earnings from any claim on my family money. The irony was delicious. The very document Richard had insisted upon to protect his future wealth contained a fidelity clause that would now destroy him. While Richard was plotting his escape with Natasha, I was building an airtight case. I consulted with attorneys. I documented every hidden transfer. I gathered evidence of their affair. I prepared divorce papers, and I timed everything perfectly, knowing Richard would want to wait until after Isabella's graduation to avoid ruining her big day. What he didn't expect was that I would file those divorce papers the morning of the graduation, with the documents sealed and not yet accessible to him. What he couldn't have anticipated was that his grand public announcement would be the final piece of evidence I needed to trigger the prenup's infidelity clause. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to that moment outside the Meridian, because what happened next was just the beginning of Richard's very bad evening. Instead of going home, I drove to Forsyth Park and sat on our favorite bench, the same bench where Richard had proposed 29 years ago. It seemed fitting somehow. I pulled out my phone and called Benjamin Cross, my attorney, to confirm that everything was in motion. "The emergency filing went through this afternoon," Benjamin told me. "The accounts are frozen as of 6 p.m. Richard will have access to his personal account for living expenses, but nothing else." "And the house?" "Yours, as per the prenuptial agreement's infidelity clause. I have to say, Victoria, I've been practicing family law for 30 years, and I've never seen a case this well documented or a prenup this ironclad." I thanked Benjamin and hung up, then sat in the peaceful evening air, listening to the sounds of Savannah coming alive around me. Couples walking hand in hand, families with children, tourists exploring the historic district, all of them living their lives, completely unaware that 10 blocks away a man's entire world was collapsing. My phone buzzed constantly with calls and texts, from friends at the restaurant, from Isabella, even from Richard's sister Elena, who had flown in from Atlanta for the graduation. I responded only to my daughter. "I'm okay, sweetheart. This isn't your burden to carry. Enjoy what's left of your graduation celebration. We'll talk tonight. I love you." I had protected Isabella from the truth for months, not wanting to overshadow her final semester with family drama. She would be angry that I hadn't told her, but I knew she would understand eventually. Isabella had inherited my analytical mind along with Richard's charm, a powerful combination that had helped her graduate summa cum laude with a degree in international business. An hour later, I finally drove home to our historic Victorian in Savannah's Garden District. The house Richard had already promised to Natasha, according to text messages he didn't realize I had seen. The house that, according to our prenuptial agreement, would remain mine, regardless of what Richard wanted. I parked in the circular driveway and walked through the front door of what had been our shared space for 15 years. Everything looked exactly the same. The antique furniture my grandmother had left me, the oil paintings we'd collected during trips to Europe, the Persian rugs that had taken me years to find. Yet everything had changed. I went upstairs to our master bedroom and opened the walk-in closet. Richard's clothes were already packed in 3 expensive suitcases, hidden behind my evening gowns, ready for his planned departure tomorrow. I smiled at his predictability. He had always been meticulous about his appearance, but careless about the things that really mattered. 3 hours later, I heard Richard's Mercedes in the driveway. The front door slammed open with enough force to rattle the antique glass in the foyer. "Victoria," he shouted, his voice echoing through the house. "Where are you? We need to talk about this immediately." I was sitting in the living room, calmly reviewing documents on my laptop. I closed it as he stormed in, his face flushed red with anger, the envelope I'd given him clutched in his manicured hand. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, waving the papers at me. "You served me with divorce papers today? On Isabella's graduation day?" "I thought the timing aligned nicely with your own plans," I replied calmly. "You wanted to start your new life with Natasha. I'm simply helping to facilitate that transition." "You had no right to." "I had every right," I interrupted, my voice steady as steel. "Just as you had every right to choose Natasha over our marriage. We all make choices, Richard. The consequences are simply part of the package." He began pacing around the room like a caged animal. "The prenup expired years ago," he said, his voice suddenly confident. "Any lawyer will tell you that prenuptial agreements become invalid after—" "Actually, it didn't expire," I interrupted, allowing myself a small smile. Section 12 specifically states that the fidelity clause remains in effect for the duration of the marriage and any subsequent legal proceedings. Your attorney should have explained that to you. Oh, wait. You didn't consult one before making your grand announcement, did you? The color drained from Richard's face as the reality of his situation began to sink in. The prenuptial agreement he had insisted upon to protect his potential wealth was about to cost him everything. The house, the vacation condo in Kiowa Island, his portion of our retirement accounts, 70% of our joint investments, all of it would remain with me. thanks to the infidelity clause he had forgotten existed. "You can't do this to me," Richard said, collapsing onto the leather sofa where we'd once planned our future together. "We built this life together, and you chose to end it," I replied, though admittedly not in the way you had planned. Richard's phone buzzed persistently in his pocket. He glanced at it and ignored it. Natasha, no doubt, wondering where he was and why he wasn't following their carefully orchestrated plan to celebrate their newfound freedom. "You've always been calculating, Victoria, but this is cold," he said, trying a different approach. "What about our history? 28 years together means nothing to you?" I studied this man I had loved for nearly 3 decades. The man who had held my hand through 2 miscarriages before we had Isabella. The man who had surprised me with a weekend trip to Charleston for our 10th anniversary. When had he changed? Or had he always been this person, and I had been too devoted to notice? "Our history meant everything to me," I answered truthfully. "That's exactly why your betrayal cuts so deeply." His expression softened momentarily, perhaps seeing an opening. "Then maybe we can work through this. I made a mistake, Victoria. People make mistakes all the time. Maybe we could try counseling, or—" "This wasn't a mistake, Richard," I said quietly. "This was a calculated plan spanning more than 18 months. You systematically moved our money. You looked at property with her. You planned to announce our separation publicly specifically to humiliate me. You're exaggerating." "Am I?" I picked up my phone, opened the recording app, and played his own voice back to him. "After the graduation, I'll tell her it's over. A public setting is better. She won't make a scene in front of everyone." Then Natasha's voice. "And she has no idea about the money?" Richard's voice again. "None. Victoria trusts me completely. That's her weakness." The blood drained from his face completely. "You recorded our conversations? That's illegal." "Not in Georgia, when one party consents," I replied smoothly, "and certainly not when the conversations are taking place in your own home. I didn't record your private moments with Natasha. I'm not cruel. Just the conversations about your plans to defraud me." Richard stood up suddenly, agitated and desperate. "I need to make some calls. I need to talk to my lawyer." "Of course," I said. "Your attorney might be a good place to start." "I'll be staying at Elena's tonight," he announced, as if this was some kind of threat. "Elena's house?" I asked innocently. "My sister's house, yes." I nodded. "She's quite upset with you, actually. Elena was the one who first spotted you and Natasha together last Christmas at the Harbor Club. She didn't tell me immediately. She confronted you first. You promised her it was nothing, that you would end it immediately. When she realized 6 months later that you hadn't kept your word, she came to me." This was yet another blow Richard hadn't anticipated. Elena and I had always been close, but he never imagined his own sister would choose my side in a divorce. "Everyone's betraying me," he muttered. "Ironic, isn't it?" I gathered my purse and the small overnight bag I had packed earlier. "You have until tomorrow evening to remove your personal belongings from the house. After that, the locks will be changed." As I headed toward the door, Richard called after me, desperation finally creeping into his voice. "What about Isabella? Have you thought about how this affects our daughter?" I paused, feeling anger break through my carefully maintained calm for the first time all evening. "Don't you dare use our daughter as a shield, Richard. You certainly weren't thinking about Isabella when you were planning your new beachfront life with Natasha." His phone buzzed again. This time he looked at it and groaned audibly. "Problem?" I asked sweetly. "Natasha is at the apartment already," he admitted. "She's moved her things in." I couldn't help but smile. "The apartment you put both your names on? The lease you signed last month?" Richard nodded, looking confused about why I was asking. "You might want to check with the leasing office," I said. That application was flagged for credit issues and never actually completed. The leasing agent called our home phone to verify information, and I handled it myself. I walked out the door, leaving Richard to face the first of many consequences. His perfectly planned new life was unraveling faster than he could process, and this was only the beginning. Elena lived in a charming antebellum home near Forsyth Park, close to the college where she taught Southern literature. When I arrived, she greeted me with a fierce hug that nearly brought me to tears. I just heard from Isabella, she said, pulling me inside. Are you holding up okay? I'm better than I expected, I admitted, following her to the kitchen where a bottle of excellent wine was already open. I never thought Richard would make such a public spectacle, Elena said, pouring 2 generous glasses. Announcing it at the restaurant in front of everyone. He's completely lost his mind. It was meant to humiliate me, I explained, accepting the wine gratefully. A public rejection so I couldn't fight back without looking hysterical. Elena's face darkened with anger. My brother always did have a flair for drama, but this is beyond anything I expected from him. We settled in her sunroom, surrounded by towering bookshelves and antique furniture that reminded me of my childhood. Elena had never married, preferring her independence and academic pursuits. Over the years, I had sometimes envied her freedom. What did you put in that envelope that made him look so terrified? She asked. I explained the contents, the divorce filing, the evidence of his financial deception, and most importantly, the prenuptial agreement that would leave him with far less than he had planned. The prenup, Elena laughed, genuinely amused. I remember when he insisted on that thing. Father had just given you that inheritance, and Richard was so worried about protecting his future earnings. She shook her head. The irony is absolutely delicious. My phone rang. Isabella. I took a deep breath before answering. Hi, sweetheart. Mom, she said immediately, her voice strained with emotion. I'm coming over to Aunt Elena's right now. Honey, you don't have to. I'm already in the car, she interrupted. Dad is telling everyone at the restaurant that you've lost your mind, that you've been planning this for months. He's saying horrible things about you. Of course he was. Richard always rewrote history to cast himself as the victim. Let him talk, I said calmly. The truth will become clear soon enough. 20 minutes later, Isabella arrived, still in her graduation dress, but with her makeup smudged from crying. She fell into my arms like she used to as a child after a nightmare. Why didn't you tell me what was happening? She asked, her voice muffled against my shoulder. I didn't want to ruin your final semester, I explained, stroking her hair. You worked so hard for this graduation. You deserve to enjoy it. She pulled back, wiping her eyes. Well, Dad took care of ruining it anyway. We moved to Elena's living room, where Isabella finally heard the full story. I told her about discovering the affair, the financial deceptions, and the detailed plans Richard and Natasha had made for their future together. I knew something was wrong with Dad, Isabella admitted. He's been different lately, distracted, always on his phone, making excuses not to spend time with us. But I never imagined it was this bad. None of us want to see these things in the people we love, Elena said gently. My phone buzzed with a text message from Benjamin Cross. The emergency filing had been approved and processed. The accounts I had identified were now completely frozen, pending the divorce proceedings. Richard now had limited access to funds, enough for basic living expenses, but nowhere near enough to follow through on the property purchases and lifestyle changes he had planned with Natasha. I showed the message to Elena and Isabella. Good, Isabella said firmly. He deserves every bit of what's coming to him. My daughter's loyalty warmed my heart, but I didn't want this to poison her relationship with her father permanently. He's still your dad, sweetheart. Your relationship with him is separate from what's happening between us. Isabella shook her head decisively. Maybe someday I'll be able to forgive him, but right now I can't even look at him. He hugged me this morning and told me how proud he was of my accomplishments, all while planning to destroy our family a few hours later. The doorbell rang, interrupting our conversation. Elena went to answer it, returning moments later with a troubled expression. It's Richard, she said grimly, and he's brought Natasha with him. I steeled myself as Elena led them into the living room. Natasha looked deeply uncomfortable, shifting her weight from one foot to the other, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape route. She was attractive in a conventional way, shoulder-length blonde hair, expensive clothes, the kind of confidence that comes from never having faced real hardship. Richard, by contrast, looked furious. His earlier desperation had hardened into barely controlled anger. Victoria, you need to stop this insanity immediately, he demanded without any preamble. Unfreeze the accounts. We can discuss this like reasonable adults. Isabella stood up, placing herself slightly in front of me in a protective gesture that made my heart swell with pride. Maybe you should have tried being reasonable before you announced to 50 people that you were leaving Mom. Richard's eyes widened as if he was just noticing our daughter for the first time. Isabella, this doesn't involve you. Doesn't involve me? She echoed, her voice rising with indignation. You destroyed our family on my graduation day, and you think it doesn't involve me? Natasha touched Richard's arm nervously. Richard, maybe we should just go. This isn't. He shook her off irritably. No, I'm not leaving until Victoria agrees to be rational about this situation. Elena folded her arms across her chest. My sister-in-law seems to be the only rational person in this scenario, Richard. You're the one who created this mess. I remained seated, watching the drama unfold with detached interest. For years, I had been the peacemaker, the one who smoothed over conflicts and kept everyone happy. That role had been exhausting, and I had finally set it down. The accounts will remain frozen until the preliminary hearing, I said calmly. That's scheduled for Thursday. The judge will determine appropriate asset division at that time. Thursday? Richard sputtered. What am I supposed to do until Thursday? You have your personal account, I reminded him. The one you've been transferring money into for the past 18 months. That should be sufficient for your immediate needs. Natasha's head whipped toward Richard with obvious alarm. You have a separate account? With how much money in it? An interesting dynamic was emerging. Clearly, Richard hadn't been entirely forthcoming with Natasha about the extent of his financial planning, or lack thereof. Richard ignored her question completely. This is vindictive, Victoria. This isn't like you at all. Perhaps you never really knew me, I replied quietly, just as I apparently never really knew you. Isabella turned to face Natasha directly. Did you know he was going to announce it like that? At my graduation celebration? Natasha had the decency to look ashamed. I thought he was going to talk to your mother privately first. The public announcement was unexpected. Richard shot her a look of pure betrayal. Cracks were already forming in their united front. I think you both should leave, Elena said firmly. You've upset Isabella enough for one day. Isabella, Richard pleaded, his voice taking on a wheedling tone. You have to understand that relationships change. Sometimes people grow apart. It doesn't mean... My daughter's face hardened in a way I had never seen before. What I understand is that you're a coward who couldn't even give Mom the dignity of a private conversation. What I understand is that you were stealing from our family while I was working 2 jobs to help pay for textbooks because you told us money was tight. Richard paled. That's not how it was. It's exactly how it was. Isabella cut him off. Please leave, Dad. I can't look at you right now. The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Richard turned to go, Natasha trailing behind him like a lost puppy. At the door, he paused and looked back at me with something that might have been regret. This isn't over, Victoria. I'll fight you on this. I met his gaze steadily. You're welcome to try. After they left, Isabella collapsed next to me on the sofa, tears streaming down her face. I've never talked to Dad like that before. I wrapped my arm around her shoulders. Sometimes standing up for what's right is painful, sweetheart. Elena brought us fresh glasses of wine. To new beginnings, she said, raising her glass. Indeed, I thought, this ending was just the beginning of something entirely new. The preliminary hearing took place the following Thursday in a small courthouse downtown. I arrived with Benjamin Cross, feeling more confident than I had in years. Richard came with a hastily retained lawyer, a young associate from a firm that specialized in corporate law, not family matters. Richard's poor choice of representation was yet another consequence of his rushed planning. Judge Margaret Thornton was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and absolutely no patience for dramatics. She reviewed our prenuptial agreement carefully, taking her time to read through every clause. This document appears to be entirely in order, she said, looking over her reading glasses at Richard's attorney. Do you contest its validity? The young lawyer cleared his throat nervously. Your Honor, we believe the agreement may have expired due to the length of time that has passed since. Section 18 clearly states that the duration covers the term of the marriage plus any legal proceedings resulting from its dissolution, Judge Thornton read aloud. There is no expiration date indicated anywhere in this document. Richard leaned forward to whisper urgently to his lawyer, who looked increasingly uncomfortable with each passing moment. Furthermore, the judge continued, shuffling through the papers, the evidence of systematic fund transfers appears to directly violate the financial disclosure requirements outlined in Section 23 of this agreement. She looked up at Richard with the expression of someone who had seen every kind of marital deception imaginable. I am ruling to maintain the freeze on all joint accounts pending full financial discovery. Mr. Sterling's personal account will remain accessible for living expenses. The family home will remain in Mrs. Sterling's possession during these proceedings, as clearly stipulated in the prenuptial agreement's infidelity clause. Richard's face flushed a dark red. "This is completely outrageous," he muttered, loud enough for everyone in the courtroom to hear. Judge Thornton fixed him with a stern look that could have frozen fire. "Mr. Sterling, I strongly suggest you review the agreement you signed more carefully. This court will reconvene in 30 days for the full hearing, after financial discovery is complete." As we left the courthouse, Richard caught up with me in the marble hallway. "Victoria, please. We need to discuss this reasonably. 28 years of marriage has to count for something." "It counted for everything," I replied simply, "until you decided it didn't." I walked away, leaving him standing alone in that courthouse corridor, the full weight of his choices finally beginning to sink in. Word of our divorce spread quickly through Savannah's tight-knit social circles. Friends called daily, some offering genuine support, others clearly fishing for gossip. I maintained a dignified silence about the details, simply saying, "Richard and I are separating. These things happen sometimes." Meanwhile, Richard's carefully constructed facade was crumbling piece by piece. The image he had cultivated over decades, successful businessman, devoted family man, pillar of the community, was being systematically dismantled by his own actions. The financial freeze meant he couldn't follow through on any of the promises he had made to Natasha. The beachfront property in Charleston they had been planning to purchase together fell through when Richard couldn't produce the down payment. The luxury BMW he had put a deposit on had to be canceled. The elaborate vacation to Europe they had planned for the summer became impossible. 2 weeks after the preliminary hearing, Elena called me with barely contained amusement in her voice. "Have you heard the latest development in the Richard and Natasha saga?" "Do tell," I said, settling into my chair with a cup of tea. "Natasha moved out of Richard's apartment yesterday. Apparently, she discovered that his business isn't doing nearly as well as he had led her to believe, and those substantial savings he bragged about don't actually exist. She told her friend Jennifer, you remember Jennifer from the country club, that she didn't sign up to date a man with serious financial problems." I couldn't help but laugh. He always was exceptionally good at creating illusions. "There's more," Elena continued, clearly enjoying herself. "Jennifer said that Natasha is already dating someone new, a real estate developer from Charleston who actually has money. The poetic justice was almost too perfect. Richard had lost his wife, his daughter's respect, his financial security, and now his mistress, all in the span of 2 weeks. Meanwhile, I was busy rebuilding my life in ways I had never thought possible. The financial security I had always maintained separately from our joint accounts gave me a freedom Richard hadn't anticipated. I rented a small but elegant office space in Savannah's historic district and began setting up the financial consultancy I had dreamed about for years. My first clients were 2 women going through divorces of their own. Word of mouth brought more. I specialized in helping women understand their finances during major life transitions, divorces, widowhood, career changes, retirement planning. The work was immediately fulfilling in a way my corporate job had never been. "I'm so proud of you, Mom," Isabella told me during one of her frequent visits from Charleston, where she had started her new job with a prestigious marketing firm. "You're helping people during some of the worst moments of their lives." "I'm just doing what I wish someone had done for me earlier," I replied, preparing women for whatever life might throw at them. Being needed for my expertise rather than my caregiving abilities was a novel and empowering experience. The final divorce hearing fell on what would have been our 29th wedding anniversary, a fitting end to a chapter of my life that had lasted nearly 3 decades. Richard arrived looking haggard and defeated. I later learned that his business was struggling badly without my financial support and guidance. Natasha was long gone, already engaged to her real estate developer. Most of our mutual friends had distanced themselves from Richard after learning the full extent of his deception and manipulation. Judge Thornton upheld the prenuptial agreement in its entirety. Richard left the courthouse with his personal possessions, his struggling business, and the money remaining in his private account, which, after paying his attorney fees and living expenses, was barely enough to secure a modest apartment across town. I retained our home, my retirement accounts, and 70% of our joint investments, exactly as the prenuptial agreement stipulated in cases of proven infidelity. The justice was absolutely poetic. The very document Richard had insisted upon to protect himself had become the instrument of his financial downfall. As we left the courthouse for the final time, Richard approached me one last time. Gone was the arrogant man who had publicly humiliated me at the Meridian. In his place stood someone who looked genuinely remorseful. "I made a terrible mistake, Victoria," he said quietly. "Is there any chance we could ever?" "No," I interrupted, but my voice was gentle rather than harsh. "That door is permanently closed, Richard." "I understand," he replied, and for the first time in years I believed he actually did. "I hope you find happiness, Victoria. You deserve it more than anyone." It was perhaps the first completely honest thing he had said to me in years. 6 months later, my consultancy, Sterling Financial Transitions, was thriving beyond my wildest expectations. I had moved from my small office to a larger space in a beautiful converted mansion and hired 2 associates. I specialized in helping women secure their financial futures, particularly during major life changes. Isabella visited often, proud of what I had built and amazed by my transformation. "You know what's really ironic?" she said during one visit. "If Dad had just been honest from the beginning, if he had asked for a divorce respectfully and privately, he might have kept half of everything." "Sometimes people can't see beyond what they want in the immediate moment," I replied. "They lose sight of the bigger picture." The woman who had once defined herself entirely as Richard's wife and Isabella's mother had discovered a completely new identity: mentor, business owner, advocate for women's financial independence. The envelope I had handed Richard at the restaurant hadn't just been my escape plan from a failing marriage. It had been the key to a door I never knew existed. Behind that door, I found not just revenge, but complete reinvention. In securing my financial future, I had also reclaimed something far more valuable than money. I had reclaimed myself. And that's exactly what I want you to remember if you're watching this and thinking about someone in your life who's underestimated you, who's taken you for granted, or who thinks they can manipulate you because they believe you're weak or dependent. Sometimes, the quietest person in the room is actually the most dangerous. Not because they're vindictive, but because they're strategic. Before you go, I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had someone completely underestimate your capabilities? Maybe a boss who thought you couldn't handle a promotion, or a family member who assumed you'd never stand up for yourself? Drop your story below, because I guarantee there are people watching who need to hear that they're not alone. And if you think Richard got what he deserved, smash that like button. If you think Victoria was too harsh, tell me why in the comments. I love hearing different perspectives on these stories. But here's what I really want you to take away from Victoria's story. She didn't win because she was cruel or because she wanted revenge. She won because she was prepared. While Richard was busy planning his dramatic exit, Victoria was quietly building her case, understanding her legal position, and securing her future. The most powerful thing you can do when someone betrays you isn't to scream or cry or beg them to stay. It's to understand your own value, know your worth, and have a plan that doesn't depend on their approval or their presence in your life. Victoria spent 28 years making Richard's dreams possible while putting her own on hold. But when he chose to end their marriage in the most humiliating way possible, she didn't fall apart. She didn't become the victim he expected her to be. Instead, she became the architect of her own liberation. Think about that for a minute. How many of us spend our lives making other people's dreams come true while our own collect dust? How many of us give so much of ourselves to others that we forget who we are without them? Victoria's real victory wasn't the money she kept or the house she retained. Her real victory was discovering that she didn't need Richard's validation to be successful, happy, or fulfilled. She had always been enough. She just needed to remember it. And speaking of remembering your worth, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because next week I'm bringing you a story about a woman who discovered her husband was planning to leave her for her own sister, and how she used their family business to serve up justice that nobody saw coming. Trust me, you won't want to miss that one. But let's get back to Victoria for a moment, because her story didn't actually end at that courthouse. There's one more piece to this puzzle that shows you just how completely the tables turned. About a year after the divorce was finalized, Victoria was at a charity gala downtown, the same kind of high society event she and Richard used to attend together. She was there representing her consultancy, which had become one of Savannah's most respected financial planning firms for women. She was talking with potential clients when she noticed a commotion near the bar. Richard was there, looking older and more worn than she remembered, having what appeared to be a heated conversation with a much younger woman. Not Natasha. This was someone new. Someone who looked like she was maybe 25 with expensive taste and high expectations. Victoria couldn't hear the conversation, but she could read body language well enough to understand what was happening. The woman was clearly upset about something, gesturing dramatically while Richard tried to calm her down. Finally, the woman threw her drink in Richard's face and stormed out, leaving him standing there dripping and humiliated in front of half of Savannah's social elite. Isabella, who had come to the gala as Victoria's guest, leaned over and whispered, "Should we feel sorry for him?" Victoria watched as Richard frantically tried to clean champagne off his tuxedo while people pretended not to stare. For just a moment, she felt a flicker of the compassion that had once made her stay in an unfulfilling marriage for so many years. Then, she remembered the text messages, the systematic theft of their savings, the public humiliation at Isabella's graduation, the years of putting his dreams ahead of her own. "No," she said quietly, "we shouldn't. Because here's the thing about consequences. They're not punishment. They're just the natural result of the choices we make." Richard chose to betray his wife, steal from his family, and humiliate the woman who had supported him for nearly 3 decades. The fact that he was now struggling to maintain relationships and financial stability wasn't Victoria's fault. It was simply the price of his decisions. Meanwhile, Victoria had built something beautiful from the ashes of her old life. Her business was thriving. Her relationship with Isabella was stronger than ever. She had rediscovered passions and interests that had been buried under decades of playing the supporting role in someone else's story. She had even started dating again, something she never thought she'd want to do. A professor from the university, a kind and intelligent man who respected her independence and celebrated her success rather than feeling threatened by it. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. Richard was trapped in a cycle of shallow relationships with women who wanted his money and status, neither of which he had anymore. Victoria was building meaningful connections based on mutual respect and shared values. But the most satisfying moment of all came 2 years after the divorce, when Isabella called with exciting news. "Mom, I've been offered a promotion," she said, her voice bubbling with excitement. "Regional director for the Southeast. It means relocating to Atlanta, but the salary is incredible, and I'll be the youngest person to ever hold this position at the company." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Victoria said, genuinely thrilled for her daughter's success. "When do you start?" "That's the thing," Isabella said, her tone becoming more serious. "The company wants to throw a celebration dinner, something fancy, with all the regional executives and their families. They asked if I wanted to invite both my parents." Victoria felt her stomach tighten slightly. "And what did you tell them?" "I told them I'd love to have my mother there because she's been my biggest supporter and the strongest woman I know. and I told them my father wouldn't be attending because he taught me what kind of person I never want to become. The pride Victoria felt in that moment was overwhelming. Not because Isabella had chosen her side, but because her daughter had learned to recognize her own worth and surround herself with people who supported her dreams rather than trying to diminish them. "You don't have to exclude your father for my sake," Victoria said gently. "I'm not doing it for your sake, Mom. I'm doing it for mine. I've watched you rebuild your entire life with grace and dignity, while he's just moved from one shallow relationship to another, always looking for someone to take care of him. I know which example I want to follow." That celebration dinner became one of the most joyful evenings of Victoria's life. She watched her brilliant daughter accept accolades from colleagues who clearly recognized her talent and potential. She saw Isabella navigate professional relationships with confidence and authenticity, never once compromising her values for approval or advancement. And she realized that perhaps the most important victory of all wasn't financial or legal. It was showing her daughter that a woman could rebuild her life on her own terms, that independence was possible, and that you never had to settle for being undervalued or taken for granted. If you're still with me, here's what I want you to understand about stories like Victoria's. They're not really about revenge, even though that's what draws us in initially. They're about transformation. They're about the moment when someone decides they're worth more than they've been accepting. Maybe you're in a relationship where you're always the one compromising, always the one making sacrifices, always the one whose dreams get put on hold. Maybe you're in a job where your contributions are overlooked or undervalued. Maybe you're in a family dynamic where you're expected to be the caregiver, the peacemaker, the one who never rocks the boat. Victoria's story should remind you that you have more power than you think. You have more options than you realize. And you definitely have more worth than anyone who's taking you for granted wants you to believe. The envelope Victoria handed Richard at that restaurant wasn't just filled with legal documents. It was filled with the proof that she had been paying attention, that she had been planning, and that she understood her own value even when others didn't. So here's my challenge for you. Start your own envelope. Maybe it's not divorce papers. Maybe it's a resignation letter, or a business plan, or documentation of your own achievements that you can reference when people try to make you feel small. Start building your own case for why you deserve better. Start planning your own version of walking out of that restaurant with your head held high. Start remembering that you are not a supporting character in someone else's story. You are the main character in your own. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own situation or inspired you to start valuing yourself more, do me a favor. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, because there are people in your life right now who are accepting less than they deserve. And sometimes all it takes is one story, one example, one reminder that change is possible to give them the courage to start writing their own ending. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about people who refused to stay down, who turned their betrayals into breakthroughs, and who proved that sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming the person you were always meant to be. Because at the end of the day, that's exactly what Victoria Sterling did. She didn't just survive Richard's betrayal. She used it as the catalyst to become the strongest, most successful, and most fulfilled version of herself. And that, more than any prenuptial agreement or legal victory, is the kind of transformation that changes everything. Until next time, remember your worth, know your value, and never let anyone convince you that you're powerless. Because you're not. You're just getting started.